Hello, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. This is JM, and I'm here with Nate, as usual, and also with a new addition to the Chrononauts team, Gretchen. Gretchen's a good friend of mine and currently enrolled in the University at Albany. We haven't known each other for too long, but after we initially bonded over our affinity for the show Sapphire and Steel, see our episode on the clock that went backwards for a little bit of my musing on that. When we started talking about more and more stuff, and I sort of started to think, wouldn't it be great to ask Gretchen to join the Officers Club? So, as some listeners may know, we did start out with a somewhat larger crew, and while I think Nate and I sort of established a pretty nice groove over the past year or so, it was always sort of in the back of my mind that I did want to bring the crew back up to 3 at least at some point, because I do think that having a group of 3 or more for a podcast like this is sort of ideal in a way, because we want to foster discussion which can be more animated when you get more than 2 people talking to each other, and also to air some different viewpoints and perspectives. And there's just so much ground we can possibly cover, so many stories we can talk about, so many different angles we can take. And I do have to admit that there have been a couple of times where I either thought initially or perhaps later on in retrospect that maybe we were missing a key perspective about something, or maybe lacking in knowledge or expertise in certain areas. More on this perhaps in a little while, actually. And it's one of the reasons. For example, Nate covers a lot of the engineering and science backgrounds that begin some of our episodes. He's just better at that stuff than I am. So it's good to have these different angles. And I wanted Gretchen to join the team because during our discussions of literature and films and television and so on, and also talk about what's currently being studied in related academic fields, I just thought, well, her enthusiasm and thoughtful analysis was in a way exactly what we were looking for. So I can't remember, Gretchen, how exactly I brought up the idea to you, but it was sort of casual. I think, hey, maybe it would be awesome if you joined in on this. And to my surprise and delight, the response was very much in the affirmative. So Nate was also keen to give this a go. So Gretchen, welcome aboard, and it's so good of you to join us. And I'm happy that you're here. You want to introduce yourself to the audience and say a few things? Maybe talk about how you came to know science fiction, what it means to you, and that sort of thing.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to join the team. So, obviously, as JM said, I'm Gretchen. I'm attending University at Albany, and I'm an English major. I'm actually planning on taking a course next semester in science fiction literature. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm sure that will help out with some of the things in this podcast. But my first exposure with science fiction, well, obviously I had read some science fiction when I was younger, but my major first piece of media was through Doctor Who and Star Trek. I got into it through TV and film, but then eventually I started to want to get into the literature. I think one of the big major pieces of literature that I read was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. And after that, I was just taken aback by how great the literature could be, so I ended up wanting to read more. And I think after that I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then I started reading Ursula K. Le Guin and Robert Heinlein and a lot of the other classic sci-fi golden age writers. So I think when it comes to sci-fi, I like that it really shows like the different possibilities of what we could become and what we already are. It can show us how wonderful the future can be, but also can warn us about where we're heading. But I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me again.
Yeah, that's great, and we're very excited to have you here. We're certainly all big fans of Doctor Who in the podcast, so I think there's going to be a lot to touch upon there.
Yeah, kind of we sneak in references when we when we can, just because I think, Gretchen, you and I had a very similar sort of pathway into this. So, Nate, when did you, I think you started watching Doctor Who in like 2010 or something? You watched the original?
So I didn't grow up with Doctor Who in a way that a lot of other people might have, but definitely watched Star Trek, Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine when it was airing. So it's always been a pretty big part of my life and pretty much how I got into the genre myself. Didn't really explore the literature until I was in college, but I've been discovering that there's a lot of really interesting stuff there from doing the podcast. And Gretchen, I know you've read some of the titles we've covered already, and some of the titles, in fact, that we're covering in the next couple episodes. So it's cool to have a perspective that you already come into the works before and can see things from a second time around.
Yeah, and I think, Nate, you're a pretty big Deep Space Nine fan, right?
Oh, yeah. I love Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, I think we all like that show, too.
Yes.
I realized that I haven't seen a lot of the episodes in a really long time, so I've been thinking of kind of going through it. Thing is, I've done that before, and I sort of stall out during the first season, and it's not necessarily because it's bad. Like, I don't actually necessarily think it's bad. It's just TV shows sometimes, like, I don't come back to them for a really long time, and then I'm thinking to myself, maybe I should start at the beginning again.
Yeah.
And that's what I do. So I end up watching the first few episodes of something over and over again, and not the rest. I think I've done that with Game of Thrones as well. I'd watch the beginning, and then I make it to a certain point, and then I'm thinking, oh, I should refresh myself and start again, and that's just the way it goes. So some of those later Deep Space Nine seasons, like the second half of the show, I probably only saw some of those episodes like when they first aired. So
yeah, no, it's really good stuff. Definitely good stuff. One project that I've been doing in my spare time is looking through some old tapes I had of Deep Space Nine for some of the promo commercials that aired in between the episode
next time
segments.
on Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, right. There was one in particular I was looking for, but I wasn't able to find it yet. If it comes up, I'll post it on YouTube or something. But a lot of fond memories with that show, definitely.
We can talk a bit more about that later if we want to. Before we do that and continue with this exciting bonus December edition of Chrononauts, I just wanted to run down a couple of things. So for anyone who's just tuning in for the first time, we discuss science fiction literature, mostly. That is mostly literature and mostly science fiction. We do cover many early works in this field from times when genre, such that it is, wasn't really established yet. And we also sort of want to verge into other territory sometimes because we're fans of horror and fantasy stuff as well and different things. So for that reason, some of the things we talk about may seem at best science fiction adjacent, but we cover them because we think they're interesting and they have some relevance to the development of this thing we all love in our own ways, science fiction. So we dig up some sort of weird stuff and we delight in doing that. This isn't really another podcast that spends a lot of time talking about the Hugo and Nebula winners, though I think we've all read some of them, and we do intend to get to covering some of these books eventually. Gretchen already mentioned Fahrenheit 451, I know that's on the list. So it'd be cool to cover some Bradbury at some point, but I'm looking forward to actually digging into slightly more obscure Bradbury maybe, because he has a lot of short stories, many of which I haven't read. And there's already a wealth of material online about these classics, new and old. So we're not in a rush, and we feel that hopefully by the time we do get to discussing some of these venerated authors and their work, you will actually care about and want to hear our perspectives on them. Finally, this is important, even though we're not actually discussing an individual story today, but this is a spoiler podcast, so unless we express true exasperation and derision with some of the material we cover, which has happened fairly recently, we are going to recommend that people come to the episodes having read some of the material. That said, we do tend to summarize the material while interjecting our thoughts and comments, and we at least try to be entertaining about it. So if you just like us and want to listen to us babble about cool stories, we certainly wouldn't begrudge you. So just be aware that we do reveal endings and plot twists, sometimes with considerable glee.
And I think this is really important for the post story we're covering next month, which has lots of twists and turns that you might not want spoiled for you.
You won't see them coming. It's pretty crazy. I'm looking forward to talking about that next month.
Yeah.
So we can be found on several different platforms. We have our main anchor.fm page at www.anchor.fm/chrononauts. Our podcast can also be found on some of your likely favorite apps or streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music. And we also upload all of our episodes to YouTube. Maybe that's in fact where you found us now. So like our videos and subscribe and all that nonsense so we can spread the chrononautical virus. And we have a blog spot where we occasionally post first translations of works or stories that are in the public domain, but maybe not readily available in text form on the internet. And you can find that at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com. We also have pages on Goodreads and Facebook. We don't use those platforms a lot, but if there's interest, we certainly could. And you can add us on Twitter too, at ChrononautsSF. And if you enjoy the music and soundscape interludes that Nate has been composing for the episodes, we have a new page where you can listen to or download them individually at chrononautspodcast.bandcamp.com. And we're also thinking of putting more dramatic readings up there. Dramatic readings are something that we've sort of been playing around with a little bit, and I certainly enjoy doing that. So while some of the material covered lately hasn't really been incredibly deserving of such treatment, it's something that we have discussed doing a little more of. So shorter excerpts and such we'll probably put in the podcast episodes, but bringing some good short stories to life is certainly a possibility that's kind of exciting. So stay tuned to the Bandcamp for that. So we just talked about Doctor Who a bit, and all three of us are, to an extent, fans. And I just wanted to mention that one of the first podcasts that I tuned into when I started getting into the idea of podcasting was the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension podcast in early 2019. Never really imagined that I'd be too interested in podcasts, and I'm not really sure why, because I was always into radio to some extent and had my own stint on campus radio, so there's really no reason why I shouldn't. The more democratized internet version of that wouldn't appeal to me, but I guess I just sort of assumed it was all amateurish or something and wouldn't be interesting. I really don't know. But the Watchers are making their way through the entire Doctor Who TV series, and they're four friends with a really great rapport and a fine sense of banter. And the episodes are entertaining, funny, and thoughtful while being pretty respectful to the material they're covering. So they're also occasionally doing bonus episodes on great stuff like the Quatermass films or Amicus horror anthologies.
Right.
And I'm giving them a plug, especially because not long after our Edisonade episode last month, I was featured as a guest on the Watchers podcast during one of the bonuses. And we were discussing a Doctor Who audio drama called The Doll of Death. Not, I would say, a particularly standout story necessarily, but it was just cool to cover it because it was part of the era that they're covering right now on the show, even though it was created much later. So it's sort of like a retrospective look at that era from a 21st century perspective. But you don't have to care about me. You like Doctor Who and just want to hear some cool folks talk about it. Definitely check them out. You can find them at watchers4d.podbean.com. And again, they have different platforms. They also just started a YouTube channel, so you can look for that. Finally, we welcome any comments from our listeners. You can leave us messages on many of the platforms mentioned earlier, or drop us an email at chrononautspodcast@gmail.com. And it's actually a comment that we received, which was initially the inspiration of this bonus episode back when we realized that Gretchen would be joining us. So back in the spring, we did a long episode crammed with many short stories. Did we do 10 or was it more than 10?
It was 10, yeah. This was episode 15 where we led with Repairer of Reputations and covered 9 others, including this one story, Runaway Cyclone by Jagadish Chandra Bose. The listener in this case who sent us an email was a little disappointed that we didn't cover the anti-colonial aspects of the story, which are detailed in the Christin Hoene paper, Jagadish Chandra Bose and the Anti-Colonial Politics of Science Fiction, which was published in the Journal of Commonwealth Literature in November 2020. When we covered 10 stories in that episode, it was stretching a bit thin, I think, but we do try to put forward a good faith effort to cover the relevant background material of the stories that we do. We are a small independent podcast, so sometimes stuff does slip through the cracks, and this paper was certainly one of them, but I think it's fair to say that if we are aware of this paper at the time of recording, we would have gone into it. So I guess with that said, let's provide a upper-level summary of the story, the paper, and its main points. So in the Bose story, a cyclone is in imminent danger of threatening Calcutta, but it veers off at the last second. Government authorities are clueless, but it shifts narrative perspective halfway through to the narrator who threw a bottle of hair oil into the storm, causing it to veer away. Hoene notes that the Western figures aren't able to figure out the problem, and the narrator uses a type of made-in-India solution to the problem, which I think is a really interesting angle that both of us didn't pick up on when we recorded the episode.
Yeah, I admit that mostly what I thought of was the commercial angle.
Yeah, and that is part of it, and I didn't really tie the two to nationalistic movements, and this is not only just a case in India, but in other places, like in mainland Europe, where places like what's now the Czech Republic was detaching from the empire. A big part of the made in Czech idea was brewing Czech beer, not being reliant on the Germans for their lagers and all that stuff.
Yeah.
How Pilsner was born. And this is another example of that. It's promoting a Indian national brand rather than a brand that was manufactured by the British Empire as a way of promoting nationalism. And again, it's an interesting angle of the story. The original version of the story from 1896 was directly sponsored and commissioned by a hair oil brand to sell products. The revised version in 1921 changes the name, so I'm not exactly sure if the name of the brand changed or Bose just wanted to disassociate it from the brand for whatever reason. But the translator does note that it was a nationalist brand, and driving businesses to a nationalist made in India type product would be an act in itself of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. The second major piece of the paper, as it relates to the story, states that Bose is subverting the genre of science fiction itself, as it contains elements closer to magical realism than science fiction. So this hinges on the 1921 version of the story, which Bose rewrote and made a number of changes to. In particular, in the 1921 version, he completely removed the English language ending, which was an excerpt from Scientific American, basically telling the reader what the mystery is. So Bose eliminated this ending and then added a portion in the middle, giving the hair oil a mystical origin. Mystical origin in that the formula came to a Hindu mystic in a dream. So Hoene posits the genres of science fiction and magical realism as being opposite one another, and for this theoretical framework, quotes Maggie Ann Bowers, author of the book Magical, with the AL in parentheses, Realism, saying, quote, "One of the characteristics of science fiction that distinguishes it from magical realism is its requirement of a rational physical explanation for any unusual occurrence." And she goes on to say, "Even when things appear to be alien or different, science fiction dictates that they be explicable within or by extension of known science." However, Bose could not have been thinking on these exact terms, and that both science fiction and magic realism as genre descriptors did not exist in 1921, never mind 1896 when the bulk of the story was initially written. It's certainly possible for works before the 1930s to be retroactively classified as science fiction or magical realism when both these terms kind of come into existence. Science fiction comes around as a term in the late 1920s, but kind of really solidifies in the 30s, and magical realism is coined to represent the Latin American fiction that is most commonly associated with in the 1950s, but there are uses of the term in the 1930s as well, which Bowers does detail. It's a very comprehensive book. But the science fiction genre hadn't taken its modern shape yet, and while all the works we've covered on the podcast so far have some elements that will be present in modern science fiction, I think if submitted word for word in 2021, very few would be considered science fiction by a modern publisher, which we'll get back to in a minute. But Hal Clements said, quote, "The fun and the material for this article lies in treating the whole thing as a game. I've been playing the game since I was a child, so the rules must be quite simple. They are, for the reader of a science fiction story, they consist of finding as many possible of the author's statements or implications which conflict with the facts as science currently understands them. For the author, the rule is to make as few such slips as he possibly can," which I think 100% ties into what Hoene is talking here, but Clement was writing in the 1950s, and with a lot of these Golden Age guys, I think that's where this line of thought really starts to come into the genre and be the real dominant shaper of how the stories take form. So Hoene refers to Western colonial science fiction, and even if we take this as meaning English language works, she doesn't really go into too much detail about what she means by this. I think in pre-World War II works, the lines between fantastical elements and purely rational physical explanations are a lot more blurred. Even in the English language stuff that's retroactively classified as science fiction, you have major authors like Edgar Allan Poe, C.S. Lewis, and Arthur Conan Doyle who deliberately play with this line, some to explicitly criticize science as an institution, which is what Bose is doing here. Even Wells, I think, could be somewhat fantastic in his writing. Possibly the earliest example of a split between this hard and soft science fiction comes from a crotchety old Jules Verne, complaining that Wells's trip to the moon might as well just be magic. And it more or less is. Authors like Wells use technology and science to talk more about the people and the society. And I think that's a more common trend in these early works than someone like a Jules Verne who takes the time to go through the scientific steps and even deliver differential equations in the text.
Yeah, and even though there is hard science fiction around today, I think that what you just described, where it's more about the people and so on,
right?
It's a lot more common nowadays too, and is probably the reason why science fiction is so popular.
Sure, yeah, but I mean, there was definitely a period, especially during the Golden Age stuff, and even before in the 30s and 40s pulps, where it seems like gadgetry and the tech wizard stuff was kind of the point. And we haven't quite got there on the podcast, but I think we might see that a lot of the New Age stuff from the 60s was sort of a reaction against that and using technology and future speculation as a means more of a critique of society rather than just tech fetishization.
I feel that it was really the Second World War that probably started that swing.
Yeah.
I think that it was before the New Age. Like, I think in the 50s, you had your magazines like Astounding, which was, yes, it was quite techy at times. You know, maybe some of the writing could be described as hard, but on the other hand, one of the key things that John Campbell wanted to bring to the fore was alien modes of thought. And, you know, that's always been, Gretchen was talking earlier on about what was of interest in the genre and what was the attraction. And for me, one of them was always, oh, how would an alien think? Mm-hmm. How would that be? And he encourages authors to do that. And you had your Galaxy magazine, which was focused on a lot of social satire, which is, again, an old, you know, we've been doing quite a lot of social satire on the podcast from the 1800s and earlier even. Yeah. So that's just a continuation of the form in a way, but with modern ideas about technology and social development and so forth brought to the forefront.
Right. Yeah, but I think Jules Verne is somewhat of an anomaly of his time in that the hard science stuff really doesn't take up a lot of the early science fiction works. And there is stuff like the stuff we covered in the last episode, which is more, you know, imperialistic, adventure-y type.
Adventure story, yeah.
But I don't know if it's just the stuff we've covered or it just feels like that stuff is a minority of the total works out there, even though it does take up a huge chunk of the genre. And I guess it's Jules Verne is a massive voice, but other French stuff that isn't Jules Verne is even more fantastical. And certainly all the Latin American stuff we've covered, which has a much more complex colonial history, is even further afield from the hard scientific stuff. So, as such, I'm not sure how much Bose's story would really be taken as a subversion of genre by contemporary readers, as it seems like the blend between science and mysticism, though albeit not Hindu mysticism in the stories we've covered, was already present in many of the major voices at the time. And plus, the intended audience of the piece was definitely not a Western reader, as the work remained untranslated into English until only a few years ago. So I don't really know how that would fit into a model of subversion, but unfortunately it's impossible to really say for sure because it doesn't look like Bose wrote anything, if much at all, on fiction itself, as much of the rest of the Hoene paper discusses Bose's writings on science, which is certainly interesting, but what Bose felt on fiction, or science fiction in particular, it just seems to be at most an educated guess. But still, the paper was quite interesting, and we will put citations to it in the bibliography of this episode, as well as the most relevant sources it cites to the podcast, which I just want to read off here. I think the most interesting and relevant to the stories we've covered on the podcast and will cover in the future is John Rieder's Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, which has a lot of interesting discussions on these certain micro-genres of early science fiction. In particular, the lost race stuff that you'd expect to be in there, but also some very interesting discussions on Wells, I thought. Maggie and Bauer's Magical Realism is a really great history of magical realism, which I think is a bit afield for our podcast, but certainly if you're into strangeness and gothic stuff, that would be right along those lines. There's also the essay by Debjani Sengupta, Sadhanbabu's Friends, Science Fiction in Bengal from 1882 to 1974, which appears in the book Science Fiction, Imperialism, and the Third World, Essays on Postcolonial Literature and Film, edited by Ericka Hoagland and Reema Sarwal, as well as the Jessica Langer book Postcolonialism and Science Fiction, which gives some background on the early years despite the fact that most of the discussion is on more modern stuff. So I guess with that said, we would like to explore this idea of science fiction, fantasy, and the historical link between the two. So I'd like to open the floor for general discussion on those kind of subjects. How do the two relate to one another? When does something stop becoming science fiction and start becoming fantasy? That sort of thing.
So there definitely seems to be quite a variety of definitions of both, and I don't think everyone is ever going to come to a complete agreement on any of it, which is fine. I don't think it's necessary to come to a consensus. I think we all have our own views, and that's good. I definitely used to be more on the I want to read science fiction and not fantasy end of things, but I've definitely sort of changed my views on that in the last several years. I guess I did a little bit when I was younger. I was into Tolkien and all that stuff, and read many of his imitators, which were very popular at that time, and I think that's why I just kind of got sick of it. And I think that the two of them are often placed together for marketing purposes, right? But I don't necessarily think that, some of my favorite stuff is science fiction that reads a little bit more like fantasy, because I feel like people who feel like they're writing more fantastical things tend to, I guess, use more elaborate style, and that's just more fun to read. So things like Jack Vance's Dying Earth, or Dune, or Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, I've seen that classified as fantasy. To me, it's clearly science fiction, but it's just written like fantasy, so I guess it makes sort of sense that that's how some people might see it, I guess. But I've always sort of been interested in the way the two cross. One of my favorite things to do when I was first learning about mythology was, specifically the Greek mythology stories, was to see if I could transpose them into a science fiction mode and make it cool. And I noticed that some authors like Dan Simmons sort of played around with that concept as well, which I think is pretty cool.
Well, I was just going to say, I remember probably a few weeks ago, JM and I were actually talking about this thing where some bookstores will sometimes separate science fiction and fantasy.
Right.
And sometimes that does make it hard to find, because sometimes there is like that really blurry line between the two, where sometimes you don't know whether they are classified as one or the other. And I do believe that there is a very blurry line. It's not clear-cut as some might believe it is. I think sometimes science fiction and fantasy really can be very similar to each other in style, and sometimes science fiction can seem more fantastic, especially when you look at some of older science fiction, as you were saying before.
Yeah, definitely. And the Rieder book, Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, mentions a couple points to this that I think are pretty interesting. He says, quote, "Pigeonholing text as members or non-members of this or that genre is intellectually frivolous, whatever consequences it might have in terms of market value or prestige. This is doubly true because, first, genre itself is an intertextual phenomenon, always formed out of resemblances or oppositions among text, and second, no individual text is generically pure. Every text produces within itself a set of generic values in tension with and interacting upon one another." He goes on to raise another interesting point in terms of this and the stuff that we're doing on the podcast, and that he brings a temporal shift in it too. He says, quote, "Thus, over and above its mere existence as an ahistorical formal possibility, the value of a genre shifts with the changes that take place in the genre system. It means a different thing to write a first-person lyric poem in the early 21st century, within a system of genres that includes television commercials, tabloid journalism, and mass-market romances than it did to write one in the early 19th, when such poetry was not a subject of college pedagogy, but was a standard feature of the gentleman's magazine. By the same token, the generic identity of individual works changes over time. Wells's scientific romance about alien invasion of Earth meant something different in 1898 than it did when Gernsback reprinted it in 1927, because what was surprising innovation in relation to the future war genre in 1898 could be read as the establishment of science fiction conventions in 1927. So I think the point where different audiences at different points in time, or even different places over the globe, will get different takeaways and feelings from certain texts as they relate to one another. We've said that we are retroactively classifying these works as science fiction, and we're certainly not the only people to do so in these particular examples, but I think there's a lot of these works that have a lot of stuff in them that leans more towards the fantastical than the perhaps common conception of them would be. For example, Frankenstein contains a lot more occult elements than might be played up in recent adaptations. And certainly the stage adaptations of Frankenstein from that time pull out a lot of the stuff that we would associate with science fiction today and play up on a more occult, fantastic angle for the resurrection of a corpse.
For me, the real science fictional aspect of Frankenstein is the ethical side of things.
Right.
I think that's where it really lies, not necessarily the method of resurrection, but the question of scientific ethics and who is responsible for these things. And like, once you bring something into the world, what kind of responsibilities do you have? Like, those are very modern questions that I think focusing on the dead body parts and the resurrection and stuff sort of misses a little bit, even though that stuff is really cool from a occult horror perspective and all that. Yeah, I like how Rieder also talks about the two phases where it starts out with a genre sort of coming into existence slowly by incorporating earlier works that are not part of that and ideas from things that obviously come from outside. And then once it's established, then it can draw upon the ideas that come from within that genre. So it sort of ties into what you're saying about Wells. I mean, now, even in 1927 perhaps, but now especially, we can look at War of the Worlds and we can say, oh wow, that's cool, that's where all that started, that's science fiction. In 1898, people weren't thinking that. They were thinking, what a new, far out and scary concept this is. And you can still think that now if you twist your mind a little bit. It's not that difficult, I guess, for some of us. I mean, some people seem to have different levels of, I guess, of the ability to do that, but I always find it really cool to sort of imagine that you're someone from the time period when something was written. Maybe not everybody does this, but I do. And it's not difficult, and it's fun. And I also think that, though, when it comes to science fiction and fantasy, we do have to remember that, like, as far as I'm concerned anyway, fantasy, even though it is a marketing term now, it's really more encompassing than that, and it's really a very old form of literature. And things that are fantastic have a lot of roots in folk traditions and mythological traditions and so on. And even though the term fantasy literature is quite new by comparison, you can trace the roots of that quite far and incorporate a lot of different things, including, I would say, magic realism, which sometimes goes by other names that are more, in fact, linked to the fantasy genre. And I don't know a lot about magic realism, but I do know that from what I've seen, part of its, I guess, allure is its genre fluidity and being able to incorporate different things from different genres, like Satanic Verses from Salman Rushdie, which is sometimes considered a work of magic realism, has not only a lot of mythological resonances from Hindu and Christian ideas and Muslim, but also some science fiction elements that are just sort of thrown in there because I think he just wanted to. And I think I like that kind of thing. I mean, I like the fluidity of it and not necessarily being too concerned with sticking to genre purity, which, as has just been said, is a sort of an artificial thing that doesn't really exist. I dig the way, like, when I first started reading sword and sorcery stories, I also thought it was really cool how some of those authors, like Robert E. Howard, would just suddenly drop in science fiction bits, and you're not really expecting it.
Right.
You read the Conan story, The Tower of the Elephant, and it's like, oh, cool, Conan, magic, sword and sorcery, wizards, and heads getting chopped off in sorcery. And then it's like, well, there's this creature in the tower, and it's actually an alien from another star, and Conan now has to rescue it. And then it kills its captor with some kind of mental laser beam or something like that. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. And Michael Moorcock liked to play around with that stuff too a lot. And some of his books, it reads so much like fantasy, and then ever so often he'll just throw in something that, and you just sort of go with it. Like, you're not thrown out of the story at all. In fact, it makes it more interesting. I always thought so.
Yeah, I haven't really read too much of the magical realism stuff. Gretchen, have you read any of that?
Yes, I've read a couple of works. I know that Toni Morrison is often considered magical realism, and it's interesting with her because she's also kind of spans through several genres where she's considered more literary fiction, but there are elements of magical realism in her work. And the Gothic, when it comes to, like, Beloved, she looks at horror in that as well. And it is kind of interesting to see that there's, even with someone who's in that genre, it's much more expansive than you would expect. And I've also read some of the other Latin American writers like Silvina Ocampo, who has written some short stories. And even though this does kind of tie in with, like, the surrealist movement, which I've read quite a bit of, JM knows this, we both read some Leonora Carrington together. The Hearing Trumpet, and she has her own complete stories that
was pretty wild.
Yes, she writes a lot of bizarre stuff, but I really enjoy her work.
Yeah, awesome. It's a genre that I would like to explore more, and there's certainly some opportunities to bring in the more science fiction end of the weird and surreal stuff on the podcast, which we're going to be getting to more of in these next couple episodes. I think that now that we've gotten some of the drier stuff like the Edisonauds out of the way, these next few episodes are going to be real exciting stuff to cover in terms of both the split between science fiction and fantasy and hard and soft science fiction, but actually good and fun stories to read too. So I'm certainly looking forward to what's coming.
The funny thing about magical realism too is I don't always recognize it when I'm reading it. Maybe it's just because I'm not steeped in it enough. And I read it and I think, oh, that was really cool. And I'm hard-pressed to say what category it fits in, but, like, I read a lot of short stories, so they come out of anthologies and stuff. So I'm thinking, oh, this is a horror story because it's in a horror anthology, right? And I don't necessarily concern myself that much with thinking about what genre it belongs to. But, I mean, for instance, not that long ago, I read the story Aura by Carlos Fuentes, and that's in the Foundations of Fear anthology. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is clearly a horror story. Apparently, though, it is read by a lot of Mexican high school students, and it is considered, again, an anti-colonialist work, and that's not really an angle that I was thinking about when I was reading it, perhaps because of the context where the story was placed. And I thought, oh, it's a really interesting horror story, which has an odd conceit of having second-person present narration, which is something you don't see very often. It was just really fascinating, right? And reading something like The Hearing Trumpet even had elements that I would say were quite fantastical or horrific even. And I just think it's interesting. I mean, people can see things in many different ways, and many of these terms are retroactively applied, like magic realism, for instance. It isn't that old of a term, even though the feeling of that might have been around for a lot longer.
I do agree with that idea of these terms, of course, coming as sort of a retrospective of something that has been around for ages. I remember taking a course a few semesters ago where we read excerpts from Journey to the West, which of course is a very old work. And it was considered when we were reading it sort of this fantasy. It's the fantastic. And of course, back then, it wasn't really considered in that label. It's centuries old, but we can now apply that because we have categories that we've created only recently that can store these stories in those.
Yeah, and sometimes I feel like these categories are more of a marketing term than anything else.
Oh, definitely.
But if we ever start doing a fantasy podcast, I think the first thing we should cover is the Iliad or maybe even Gilgamesh. I mean, you could really stretch it back to the beginning of time.
Yeah, definitely. that would be pretty cool, but I don't know if we can really take on a fantasy podcast.
No,
too,
I don't think so.
But still, it's a cool thought. Yeah. And, a lot of the time, I guess now I'm used to the idea of weird fiction, which sort of incorporates a little bit of everything strange and outre. It could be horror, it could be fantasy, it could be science fiction, all of that and more. It's so interesting because, again, I think a lot of the time it's a feeling, and you just know the feeling when you read it, and you're like, yeah, that has that weird feeling. And it's a difficult thing to articulate. And I guess it's something that has come to have meaning over time because so much has been written about it. And people have thought about it and what it might mean as it's developed. So it's an interesting discussion to have for sure. But I do think on the podcast, we already delved into some really strange territory with the mesmerism and spiritualism episodes and like A Voyage to Arcturus. Those things they're not what most people nowadays would think of as science fiction, but they definitely address principles that people would have thought at the time, especially proponents of ideas of animal magnetism and so on, would have thought of as very scientific.
Right.
And Voyage to Arcturus is something that sort of takes little bits of that and throws in an interplanetary voyage and Gnostic spiritual ideas and Norse mythology and all these different things into a huge blender of weirdness. That also predates the term science fiction, of course, being written in 1920, but it was just around the corner. So you can already see a little bit of the bringing in of technology and space travel and so on. And of course, there's other examples of that, like with H.G. Wells and his Cavorite and so on, getting to the moon. And already in those kind of works, you can see a lot of the ethnological exploration and the description of alien societies, which I guess always interested me a little bit more than the hard science, even though the hard science interested me too. And it's a bit of a cliche to say, oh, I want my stories to be about people. I would say the only reason I really want that is that that's probably the thing I understand most. So, not necessarily that I think it's better. But I mean, I guess it probably is in the sense of telling a good story, maybe. But it's just, I don't really have a science background, so although I've always been really interested in it, there's certain points where certain books, they get so technical that I do get a little bit lost. So, and usually that doesn't happen with science fiction, but it might have happened a few times. I can't think of too many examples right now, but I know, Nate, you brought up Hal Clement before.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was a chemistry teacher in his day job, and a lot of his stories really do read like chemistry problems he's setting up for his high school students. And, it's an approach you can take with the literature. Sometimes it works. He's better in short story form than novels, I think.
I think a lot of these guys are.
Yeah.
Honestly. I think that that's true of Isaac Asimov as well, who is also a science teacher for post-secondary students. So he wrote a lot of really cool short stories, and certain novels are quite well remembered today, and obviously Foundation's just been made into a very high-budget TV series.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of it yet. It's got kind of bad reviews. Yeah,
it seems like a mixed bag, but the thing to take away, I think, from what I've heard mostly is if you're expecting something like the books, you're not going to get it. So, that's fine, but it just begs the question, why not just make it something else, right? But I don't know. That's something where probably none of us are qualified to discuss, because I'm assuming, Gretchen, you haven't seen it either.
No, I have not.
It takes me a long time to get to TV series. I kind of like to wait till they're done. Just in case. I definitely think that covering a lot more short stories is something we'll be doing more on the podcast too.
Yeah, that's always been our philosophy kind of going forward, is novels really get a lot of the attention, and sometimes short stories are just as good and just as important for how the genre takes shape, especially when you get into the magazine era where a lot of this stuff really is proliferated in short story format. So yeah, we're going to definitely be covering a lot of that stuff, continuing going on in the future. And as far as these next upcoming episodes, we are spending a lot of time in that weird, proto-weird fiction vein. So there's going to be a lot of that very odd feeling that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about that because that's kind of my favorite stuff, so... And with the short stories, too, I mean, you got people like Bose who probably had no interest whatsoever in writing a novel.
Right.
But thought it was a perfectly cool exercise to just do a little short story, which perhaps I dismissed as being really silly initially, and I mean, I still think it's pretty silly, but it maybe has more intrinsic value than what I at first thought.
Yeah, definitely.
Gretchen, did you get a chance to read that story?
I did. I read that yesterday before this. I did find it sort of endearing in a way. Like, I thought it was silly, but it did feel like, especially getting the context of the anti-colonialist perspective, I think that does sort of add to it, but it does feel like, when I was first reading it, like just more of a silly story, but not in a way that annoyed me or that I disliked.
Yeah, no, it's a fun little story. And I get the feeling he had fun writing it, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting place in science fiction history. The essay that I mentioned earlier, which again we'll be putting in the bibliography, details a lot of what could be classified as similar science fiction from Bengal at the time. And a lot of it really does have one foot in the fantastical. Unfortunately, not a lot of that stuff is translated into English, which is a problem that we keep running up against when we try to cover stories from India, Japan, or China. But we, I guess, are trying to do the best we can with what is currently available.
Yeah, and we do have a few reference works to look through as well, and I think we should be able to find some more cool stuff as we move on through the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
And we're not really sticking to an exclusively chronological framework. I'd kind of actually like to start doing more actual direct linking between older works and more modern ones.
Yeah.
So, you know, it would be really fun to, for example, cover something from the 1800s and something from recent times in the same episode, if their themes are somewhat similar. Yeah. And if we can figure out a way to work them together.
So you guys think up of modern works and old works that would pair well with it, and those will be fun episodes, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a few ideas that have sort of suggested themselves while reading through some of the, you know, reference materials. Like, there's some cool sounding newer works that are inspired by the Hollow Earth stuff, for instance.
Right.
And some cool sounding, well, for instance, I mean, even though Nate didn't get a chance to read it, but I just kind of decided to read that new Steam Man story by Joe Lansdale, and it had a lot of genre reminiscences and tied into the Time Machine and all that stuff. But it was definitely a new work. It was very violent and bloody and stuff in it, but it just totally paid tribute to a lot of works from the 1800s in what I thought was a pretty cool way. So I'd kind of like to do more stuff like that moving forward. So it's going to be interesting to see what we come up with in the coming months. We have some really cool stuff coming up on body modification and other things too, and we can probably, if not talk about modern stories during those episodes, bring up some more contemporary concepts from nowadays.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot to cover on biomedical stuff, especially as the technology rapidly changes and progresses in the modern era that it is. There's a lot more room for speculation on where this is all headed now that we're 100 years closer.
So just wondering, Nate, you kind of alluded to this earlier. I'm just kind of curious. How is your perception about this, about, I guess, the genre and the stories as a whole? Has it changed since we started doing the podcast? Do you have any general observations about that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been a while since we recorded the episode 0 thing, and we've certainly read a fair amount since then. By my count, we hit 100 stories during the Edisonade episode.
Yeah, I wasn't counting, and I was very sort of surprised when you mentioned that. You know, we've done 100 stories.
Yeah, which is just really a drop in the bucket, but hopefully it's a significant enough drop for us to get a feel for how the genre has really progressed up to, say, 1900 or so. And I think one thing that I talked about in that episode was the emphasis and importance on human agency and less of a divine inspired or something like that. And in a sense, that is a part of it, but I think that's maybe less important than I had initially thought before going into this, because a lot of these works, again, I don't know if it's just the cross-section we pulled because they sounded more interesting than reading 100 titles by Louis Sanarins, but a lot of the stuff, like the stuff we covered in the spiritualist episode, or even some of the utopias we covered, really, there's not a lot of human agency or maybe pure scientific speculation in there. There's certainly elements of what is present in modern science fiction and some science fiction-y elements, but it's maybe a lot more downplayed than you might expect.
I think that does have a lot to do with the stories we pulled, though.
Yeah, it could. It certainly could.
I think that we're probably, I'm just guessing here, but I think that we're probably the first science fiction podcast to do a spiritualist episode.
Yeah, it might be possible. Though we're not the first people to classify any of those texts as science fiction.
No.
We are probably the first podcast, I didn't even know about that. Balzac is not really associated with science fiction, and I don't think a lot of people would associate the two stories we covered with science fiction, but I think everything else we've done on the podcast, somebody other than us has called it science fiction.
Marie Corelli certainly wrote a lot about electricity and its magical properties.
Right.
So, electric Christianity and all that. By the way, my electric Christianity course is available for $15,000 if anybody's interested.
Steal at any price.
Yeah, watch us get a bunch of emails now. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of a facet of our personal interest. There are a lot of authors that I think are new to me, to both of us, and I think will be to Gretchen as well, that I had never heard of, like J.H. Rosny, for instance, who I'm very interested in reading more of.
Yeah. Some of this stuff has really taken me aback and blown me away, and one of the stories we're doing this episode, Arctic, is one of those. And Gretchen, I know you've read this one before, but I'm just finding it incredibly strange in ways that no other work I've read captures. And it's, I think, only from doing a project like this that I would have come across that.
Oh, that's really interesting. I am looking forward to getting to that. I haven't started reading it yet.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily call it good in the same way that I wouldn't call, like, listening to the Shags record a good musical experience, but it's certainly an interesting one, that's for sure.
Yeah. So are you directly comparing her to the Shags now?
Yeah, I think it's an apt comparison. I do. It's that very strange outsider feeling that it just leaves you with a lot of questions, but hits you in a very strange, almost intensely personal way that it's kind of hard to do through some of these other authors who are writing a more, I guess, traditional adventure narrative or something like that.
So since this is the bonus episode, I think I kind of interject here and say that probably only music nerds really know about the Shags, but they were a group of 3 sisters based in New Hampshire, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes, your home state.
Yeah.
And they didn't really know anything about music at all, and their father basically said, well, your mother, who's now dead, was a fortune teller, and she told me one day that you girls would be world-class musicians, so that's what you're gonna be. And essentially sort of forced them into playing music, as far as I understand it. And they had no real conception of real harmony and melody and chord structures or anything, and even though they apparently practiced a lot, they never really did. And it sort of goes to show that you can't really force yourself into something and be, I guess, accepted as traditionally good at it. You sort of have to have a feeling for it when it's art anyway, or something like music. It has to sort of come to you naturally, even though learning things like theory and practicing your instruments definitely helps a lot. The One Shags record is sort of like it's sort of a landmark in musical history in a way. Frank Zappa once famously said that he preferred the Shags to the Beatles. So there you go.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting record. Gretchen, if you haven't heard it, I will send it to you.
I have heard some of the tracks from it.
Okay.
Because I actually first heard of the Shags in this graphic novel that it was called Brazen, and it went over like multiple women in different fields and everything. Like looking at like really bizarre like icons of history. And they mentioned the Shags. They also had like Tuva Janssen in it and some other like more obscure people in it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to make a mix to clear your party, you could put on it the Shags and the Residents and maybe Diamanda Gallis.
Yeah. I guess with both the Residents and Diamanda Gallis, they kind of know what they're doing in a sense. Where I guess talk about it more when we do the episode, but Arctic it just feels more like she didn't, but it gives it a very, again, touchingly personal feeling to it that just hits you in a very odd way. So I'm looking forward to covering that for sure.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about that more next month when we come back from the break. So normally when we do a bonus episode, until now anyway, we have sort of established a bit of a routine of sort of running down some of the stories that we've covered. But it wasn't really that long since we did the last bonus episode. It's kind of a special thing because we're not really recording anything else this month, and Gretchen is new, and we're just sort of trying something a little different. So I don't think we're going to do that this time. Maybe next time we do a bonus, we can sort of talk about what stories we really liked last several podcasts and what stories we didn't like. Because I thought that was kind of fun last time. For some reason in the last year or so, I've gotten sort of addicted to lists on the internet, which is kind of a bad thing. But at the same time, it's kind of relaxing in a strange way to just hear people go through their, what they like and what they don't like. Lately, my thing has been discography videos where they talk about the discographies of bands with a lot of records and just sort of put themselves through listening to every single record and rank them according to how they prefer them. So, but anyway, we're not going to do that this time. I just thought, we just talk a bit about what we've all been watching and reading and listening to lately. So, what have you been reading or watching lately and enjoying or not enjoying, as the case may be?
As JM already knows, I've been watching the series Man from U.N.C.L.E., which is a spy show. It's technically like Spy-Fi, and it's from the 60s, and there's 4 seasons, and I'm pretty much done with the 3rd season. I'm starting the 4th. It's very silly. There's so many different tones. Each season takes such a different mood from the other one, but I really enjoy it. I like the 2 main characters. The actors in it are pretty charming to watch.
Doesn't Grayson Hall guest star in one of those episodes?
Perhaps?
I know that came up somewhere. She did something like that.
Who's that?
She was on Dark Shadows, Julia Hoffman.
Oh.
I think she actually might have been in the episode, one of the 2 episodes that's actually written by Harlan Ellison.
Oh, okay.
Ah, okay. Was that the Auntie Judy?
I think she actually did play her. She plays a literary critic that has the same name as another science fiction writer, which is why
Judith
for a long
Merrill.
time. Yes. Which is why for, I think it was like 20 years or so, they wouldn't show it because of lawsuit reasons.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
So, I have also been watching The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I can say that Gretchen actually introduced me to it because we were talking about Sapphire and Steel, and Ilya, the Russian agent, is played by David McCallum, who plays Steel in Sapphire and Steel, which I didn't know. I mean, I've heard of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. a fair bit, and I don't really know if I would watch it. Just kind of thought, oh, it sounds like it might be cool. Maybe I'll watch it someday, but spy stuff is not... I mean, I like it. I like the James Bond movies, and last year I actually watched most of them. I skipped a few, but I'm only in the 1st season, but I'm actually really liking it now. It's the episodes are kind of all over the place, but they're also really funny sometimes, and they're just really fun to snark at, but in a fun, respectful way, not in a, oh, this is so cheesy and dumb way, but in a, these guys are in on the joke kind of thing. And there's some cool episodes with pretty prominent guest stars in them. I don't know about the person you mentioned, Nate, but I watched one with Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner, and I guess that was the first thing they were in together.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I think it was 2 years before TOS came out.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, I haven't seen that myself, but it's been on the list. One of these days I'm going to get through UFO, which is, I guess, the next thing that I wanted to watch for 60s sci-fi adjacent stuff.
I want to watch that. How many episodes of UFO are there?
Not that many. I think it was only 1 season.
So there's only 2 seasons of Space 1999, and that's kind of considered the sequel to UFO.
Yeah.
Although it isn't really a sequel, but the thing is, if I'm not mistaken, some of the UFO stuff mentions the moon-based Alpha, which is entirely where Space 1999 takes place. And so they're kind of linked in that sense. And of course, they were both created by Jerry Anderson.
Right.
So I haven't seen any of UFO yet, but Space 1999 was something I kind of started watching in 2018, I think it was. And it is such a weird show. It's I don't know, it's kind of Star Trek-like and kind of a Space Odyssey-like. but I don't know, it's just, it has a really strange feeling to it. Like, the scientific stuff is really nonsensical.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. UFO is definitely very similar in that it's like swinging 60s, like gadgets and a lot of that stuff.
Right, but this is like super 70s and
Yeah.
existential and weird. Like, it's the first season especially, it gets into some really odd territory where it's like sort of grandiose and emotional and like, I don't know, it's like when the Star Trek does those episodes based on Shakespeare, like it's almost kind of like that.
Right.
But then, I don't know, like some of the regular stars are sort of like Martin Landau plays the base commander, and his wife is the medical officer, and then Barbara Bain, I think that's her name. And then they have a whole bunch of cool guest stars like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee and Joan Collins and Brian Blessed and Patrick Troughton, and like, it's pretty neat. And then the second season goes all like, and they kind of dumbed it down a little bit for the second season and made it way more action oriented and brought in like a shape shifting alien girl and stuff. And but it's cool. It's different.
Yeah, definitely one of those things I want to check out. I haven't really watched too much TV recently. I think the only thing I've watched all the way through is the, I guess, currently airing show. I don't know if it's done or not. What We Do in the Shadows. It's like a vampire mockumentary type thing.
I've heard of that.
TV show stars Matt Berry, who was in Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, and he's really an outstanding comic actor. More so in Dark Place, which I think is overall much better written, though. What We Do in the Shadows is still pretty enjoyably.
I need to watch that. That sounds so cool.
Yeah.
There's so many incredible lines in Dark Place, and Berry really delivers them all perfectly.
You were telling me about that before, and I'd heard about that, and I'm definitely interested in finding it. I haven't really thought to look like extensively for it, but now that I've been reminded of it again, I probably will.
Yeah, pretty much all the episodes are on YouTube.
Yeah.
Nice.
Have you seen that one, Gretchen?
No, I do have it saved on YouTube, though. That was one I planned on watching sometime.
It's so good.
I have seen the film, What We Do in the Shadows, but I haven't seen the series.
Yeah, they're kind of related in that the people from the film will, like, pop up every now and then from in the show, but the show is more or less just like a recasting and relocalization of the movie set in New York rather than New Zealand.
I was over at my friend Jonas the other week, and he and his partner were watching that. And then we watched the film The Uninvited, and it was a 1940s sort of haunted house movie. I liked it, but it was a little bit low-key for me, I think. So, I mean, I guess maybe... I thought it was cool, though, that it was a 40s film that went all out with the supernatural aspect, because I think that a lot of the movies from that time sort of felt like they had to explain everything at the end or play it as a comedy, and that movie didn't do either of those things. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I have seen a couple movies recently. I'm not familiar with that one. I watched Deadly Games, which I think they sued Home Alone for ripping it off or something like that. But
is that the French film?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Doesn't it have another name, like a really wacky name that has to do with the phone code or something?
Possibly. A lot of those films had a lot of weird titles in English, but yeah, pretty dark, definitely compared to the rather comic in tone Home Alone. Certainly more of a horror movie.
It's like mid-80s, right?
Yeah, late 80s, early 90s, something like that, yeah.
But it does predate Home Alone, right?
Oh, yeah, significantly.
So Home Alone is making a bit of a resurgence of some sort lately.
Is it? I haven't seen anything.
Yeah,
I think wasn't there a new film that came out for it or something? I thought it came out. So there's like, I don't think many people are too happy with it, but I heard there was something that came out.
It wouldn't surprise me. It seems like with every other successful franchise that ever existed, they're always willing to crank out new entries 20 years later.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. I was watching a video yesterday, and somebody pointed out something really, really obvious, and that it's just so obvious that I'm almost surprised. Like he said, nobody ever remakes things that were bad or didn't do well.
Yeah.
They always remake the things that were good, and so they're obviously already working against the expectations of... I mean, why would you remake something unless you thought, I can do better than this?
Right.
Yeah.
Or I can provide some kind of different angle that's really valuable, right? So, I mean, if you're remaking something that's like, maybe has one kernel of a good idea in it, but didn't get executed very well, then maybe you could be more lauded than remaking something that is considered a classic of its time.
Look for the Simpsonia movie next year.
Oh! Yeah. You know, I was thinking, I was reading the Arthur Gordon Pym, and I thought, oh, like, this would make a really cool, weird movie.
Oh, yeah.
It would be more than just a sea adventure. Like, they could really do something strange with it. But we'll talk about that more next time.
Yeah.
I haven't been watching too many films. I did watch Frenzy by Hitchcock not that long ago. It's something that I watched maybe 10 years ago. I went to a film festival event, or a series of events, actually, where Guillermo del Toro presented Hitchcock films. And that was certainly one of the highlights because I hadn't seen it yet. And sort of definitely a very dark Hitchcock film. And not like most of the classic ones just because he went back to Britain towards the end of his career. And so it kind of, has a lot of veteran British actors in it and stuff. And it just has a different feel than the Hollywood movies. And there's a couple of really harrowing scenes in it. I thought the ending was genius. Like, it was just so on point and sort of like ambiguous as to where things go now, but it just ended in such a perfect way. Like, it was really good. Great film.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one either, but I'll definitely have to check that out. I do like Hitchcock stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Gretchen, you watched Rear Window recently, right?
No, we did not. We were supposed to watch it with one of my friends, and I were supposed to watch it, but
you didn't. Right? Okay.
Yeah, it was strange. I have the pretentious streaming service, the Criterion Channel.
Oh, they do great transfers of movies.
Yes, and they have a lot of, like, a wide variety of stuff on their service. And one of the things that they're doing, actually, is Hitchcock for the holidays. And they put a bunch of Hitchcock films up, and we were supposed to watch that. But they do the thing where if you share it with someone, the screen goes black. Like, they don't want you to share it with other people. So we ended up not being able to watch it, but perhaps now that I'm home and I can see her in person, maybe we'll watch that or Rope.
Have you ever seen Repo Man?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, that's
It was a while
stuff.
ago, but that's a good movie.
Yeah, I'm really glad that got a Criterion treatment.
Mm-hmm. I have the Criterion DVD for that.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's based on a short story by Cornell Woolrich, which I think is pretty cool.
Huh. We might have to work that into the podcast then.
Yeah, well, it's really funny. I keep discovering that movies that I didn't know were based on books were actually based on books. Today I found out that the classic late 70s The Warriors was actually based on a book.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Never knew that till now either. So it's just funny that sometimes it's really obvious. Like, I think everybody, pretty much even people who haven't read it, know that Lord of the Rings is based on books by Tolkien, but sometimes it just seems to completely slip under. The films are much more known than the source material. I don't know, I think that's really interesting. Like, sometimes I wonder if it's deserved or not. And it makes me want to read where the things came from, right?
No, definitely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been watching, actually Gretchen and I both been watching the Amicus horror anthology films.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Those are a lot of fun. I watched Tales from the Crypt and...
You mentioned The House That Dripped Blood.
Yeah, House That Dripped Blood, that was it.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we watched both those, and The Vault of Horror, which has Tom Baker in it, with a beard, as a pissed-off artist, doing a sort of a theater of blood and getting vengeance on all his critics.
Yeah, they're fun. They're definitely fun.
Yeah, have you seen that one, Nate?
No, I haven't, but all the other ones are on the list for me to check out. I really like that whole 60s, 70s British horror film vibe.
Oh, me too.
Hammer films are great stuff, and sometimes the off-Hammer studios like Amicus or... What was the other minor...
Tygon.
Yeah, right, exactly. They have some good stuff, too.
Yeah, so interesting thing about Tygon, somebody we're going to talk about at some point soon is H. Rider Haggard, and Tygon was actually started by his son or grandson, I think. So that's kind of a neat little connection there. But they did Witchfinder General and Blood on Satan's Claw.
Yeah.
Those are classics. I think Witchfinder General is like probably one of the best Vincent Price performances that I know about.
Yeah, definitely one of the darkest.
Oh, yeah. Don't call me Matthew! But, yes, what was the last one? Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. And an interesting thing about the Amicus ones is that 4 of them are based on short stories by Robert Bloch. And 2 of them are based on EC Comics, which are the Tales from the Crypt and the Vault of Horror that we mentioned earlier. And one of them is based on stories by R. Chetwynd Hayes, who's a writer that's not very known today, but I guess he wrote a lot of horror stories in the 50s and 60s, and the movie The Monster Club was also based on his stories, and that's kind of something that I consider a post-Amicus anthology, because there were the two from the later 70s after Amicus had sort of dissolved. One of the two guys responsible for Amicus, I think it was Milton Subotsky, but it could have been the other dude, whose name I forgot. But he kind of teamed up with some other people. They went to Canada to do The Uncanny, which is a really silly movie about evil cats, but it's also an anthology. That one is definitely something to be enjoyed with friends. I think I might have brought that up in one of our bonus episodes, because I know that Jonas and I were watching a bunch of those anthology films as well. We did do that one because the idea of cats out to get us was just too much to resist, I think. That's probably about it for the watching. Been reading a few things. I'm actually really excited now because one of the roleplay groups that I'm in, we were playing Dungeons & Dragons, but I think the DM kind of got a little bit bored with the dungeon crawl thing and kind of wanted to try some different settings and stuff, so it kind of morphed into a sci-fi thing. And I was telling Gretchen about this today, but maybe you've heard of the game Paranoia, Nate?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It's been a very long time since I played it. There was a text version, was it C64? There must have been a DOS port. But yeah, I played that as a kid and haven't revisited it since.
Yeah, I also learned about it from a computer game. It was like an online BBS game. It was actually called The Infinity Complex.
Okay.
And it was based on Paranoia. And I remember, like, the game seemed a little bit buggy and nobody else was playing, so, like, after kind of digging around with it for a bit, I got sort of bored. But then I was reading all the help files, and I got really excited by the actual concept of the game that it was based on, and that was, like, more exciting than playing the online version. But I never actually got to play it, and somebody brought it up in our group today, and I'm like, yeah, I would love to play Paranoia. That game sounds amazing. So it's essentially a sci-fi dystopia kind of setting, and you are slaves to a computer, and this computer essentially runs this massive city called the Alpha Complex, and you are sent on various missions. You're part of a group of people that are called the troubleshooters, and they're called that because they shoot trouble. And you go around eliminating security threats. And the computer is always giving you nonsensical directives, and, you know, you have a bunch of clones of yourself because you're probably going to die a whole bunch of times. And, yeah, and you can join secret societies and stuff like that, and it just seems like it'll be a lot of fun, so I'm looking forward to actually playing the real game, as opposed to the sort of not that great online version, but that still sounded like it could have been amazing.
There's an interesting crossover between science fiction literature and early text adventure gaming. I mean, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the game, is one of the most infamous examples of nonsense solutions for unplayable games. It's very, like the book itself, a deconstruction of the form altogether. And Paranoia and some of the other titles like Suspended don't nearly go as far with it as Adams does with the game. Though I'm not sure how much he was personally involved with the development.
Adams, I think, was quite involved in the development of the game.
Yeah, right.
And he also wrote another one for them called Bureaucracy. Are you familiar with that one?
I don't believe so.
So, guys, Bureaucracy is this really cool game where you are a person who has been targeted by bureaucracy, and you have been targeted. In the end, it turns out you've been targeted by this weird hacker who has some random thing against you. Like, he's literally called Random Q or something like that. But it seems at the outset that essentially all the institutions that are supposed to be a part of society now are turned against you. And you essentially have to figure out how to subvert them. And your score, unlike most video games, is something that you have to keep down, not up, because your score is your blood pressure. So the more intensely you find yourself at the mercy of the bureaucratic systems, the higher your blood pressure gets. So you want to actually keep your score low. So the game actually starts out with you having to fill out a form. And the form has things on it like your name and your address and your phone number and a whole bunch of stuff. And this is, keep in mind, this is a game from the 80s. It's not online, so it's not meant to be, like, this information isn't disseminated anywhere. And there's a couple of random questions, like the name of your ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend or something. And randomly, as you fill out this form in the different fields, snarky comments will appear that are like dissing you and making fun of you and your answers. Yeah, that's a Douglas Adams creation that not too many people know about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think perhaps when we get forward in time and start to cover more of the works from when computers start to emerge, we'll get into those, I guess, emerging forms of new formats of literature. Because, I mean, there's really no other way to describe something like that. A game like the Hitchhiker's Guide game isn't meant to be played as a traditional game. It's meant to be read and enjoyed as an experience like you would with a Douglas Adams novel. And
Yes.
it makes it interesting as a form of literature because, in a sense, that they're not only doing speculative things with the technologies in the stories, but they're doing things with the technologies themselves as a way of shaping the stories as a form. And I think that's really cool when it starts to emerge. And in some ways, gaming has kind of circled back to that as more of a literary form in some aspects rather than something like a shooter type game where it's more based on hand-eye coordination skill or something like that.
Yeah, and Gretchen and I were talking about this not long ago. Gretchen is probably, I'm not sure how much you do, Nate, but Gretchen is probably one of my few friends who doesn't really play a lot of video games. Mm-hmm. And so many people that I know are just, they're really into that, and it's always been sort of an area that I've been cut off from. But the text adventure games, which are also known as interactive fiction, right, is a different thing, because they're not, it's all based on text, and usually they're not timing based, so you have as long to think about what you're going to do next as you possibly want.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And you just explore the environment and make certain decisions and solve puzzles, and you type in words to do the things that you want to do. Now they have web-based ones where it's not so much about typing in words. Sometimes you have to select from different paths in links and stuff like that. But I recently saw a web-based port of a game system that I used to play when I was really young called Emon, which was designed for the Apple II computer. And it was a very basic role-play system where you created a character and you had different abilities and weaponry. And you had adventure games that were on discs, and the discs would carry over your character from the master disc, so you could play that character and wander through a maze and mostly just kill monsters and collect treasure. But there were some of them that were a little more complex. I didn't find out about those till later because I only had access to a few of them. And the ones that were really complex were sometimes on like multiple discs, and they took up too much memory, so the speech program wouldn't run. I only had access to some of those simple ones, but yeah, I mean, it was pretty neat to discover that that's kind of still alive, because I would never have thought that. Somebody decided to port over a lot of those games to the web, so now you can play them on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not as popular as it once was in the 1980s, but definitely survives in some capacity as a form of experimental fiction. Certainly interesting.
Yeah, in a way you can kind of see it as linked with the role-play books, like the most famous example was Choose Your Own Adventure, but there were a lot of other ones from back in the day. Sometimes actually annoys me a little bit that the specific Choose Your Own Adventure series gets a lot of accolades when there were so many other ones that I don't think they came after necessarily. I think a lot of them were inspired by Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. So like you had the Fighting Fantasy series, which was a little bit more complex than the Choose Your Own Adventure games, because again, you had a character sheet and you had to do a lot of dice rolling and stuff like that. But essentially, they were single books with their own rules and environment and gameplay and stuff, and you would flip to different pages depending on what paths you chose. So I had a friend who introduced me to a lot of that stuff in the very early 90s. We would play some of those books together, and there's a web port of some of that stuff now too, and people are coming up with their own adventures.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Some of them are really hard. I don't know that I ever actually successfully completed one of these. They're pretty difficult. Sometimes I feel like they stack the stats against you kind of thing, and it's actually very difficult to not die, which seems, again, very different from the Choose Your Own Adventure, which tended to be more child-friendly. Like, there were a few ways you could die, but usually they were, a little easier to solve and complete. So So, and then, as usual, I've been reading short stories. I just finished with Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus, which I thought was pretty crazy and awesome. What else? Yeah, just that, and the podcast material, a lot of short stories. I read Creatures of Light and Darkness from Roger Zelazny, because in October, I read my first Roger Zelazny book in a couple of years, which was The Night in the Lonesome October, which Gretchen also read. Mm-hmm. And I really, really enjoyed it, and I just kind of was in the mood for more of him. So Creatures of Light and Darkness is a book that we might do on the podcast when we do our mythological tie-in kind of episodes, because it is a really experimental work that sort of incorporates Egyptian mythology into a science fiction context. And the book was very, I already said experimental, so I'm trying to find a different word to describe it. It was very, like, freeform in its literary permutations. Like, it switched styles a lot, and it did it in a really interesting way. Sometimes it read like, there were a lot of really epic battle scenes, and then sometimes the text would, like, transmute itself into sort of lyrical poetry, and then there were some bits that were like stage play. And I don't know, the book was apparently dedicated to Samuel Delany, and it kind of had that feel of some of his works, I guess, a little bit. So, I don't know, it was very interesting. It was way more experimental than Night in the Lonesome October, which was a really, really fun sort of Halloween-inspired adventure. I think I gave both those books 4 stars on Goodreads, because it was just quite an experience.
I'm also reading Nights at the Circus. I haven't finished it, but that's because I also, for class, recently read Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which I really enjoyed. I want to read more of his trilogy.
I want to read that one.
I also watched the film after reading the book. It is pretty different, I would say. If you've seen only one or watched or read only one, it takes like some of the similar like plot beats, but there's quite a lot of differences. Other than that, yeah, as JM said, I did read A Night in the Lonesome October, which I also really enjoyed. It was a lot of fun to read that one. I didn't read Creatures of Light and Darkness, though. I read a Man from U.N.C.L.E. tie-in novel called The Vampire Affair, which I was able to finish right around Halloween when I actually dressed up as a vampire, so that was pretty fun.
Yeah.
I was thinking, it would be kind of interesting at some point maybe to do a Spy-Fi episode or
absolutely.
Something, and maybe look at one of those.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for that sort of stuff in the 20s and things.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking what angle, like how are we going to tackle that? I'm not quite sure, but it's going to be interesting.
Oh, there's a lot of entry points for sure.
Have you read Annihilation, Nate?
No.
The movie was very good. I haven't read the book yet. Like I said, I'd like to. I thought the movie was really cool. I sometimes, I don't know, I have a propensity to get into older films and shows, so sometimes when something newer comes along that I really, really like, even though I know it shouldn't be, I'm almost surprised at how much I like it. Yeah, I thought it was really good. The film was, I think, Gretchen, you said it was like, cause the film is a lot more like horror inspired, perhaps, than the book is.
Yeah, I'd say that I feel like the book is a bit more, like, it's more weird fiction, but it doesn't necessarily rely as heavily on horror. I think that the film does just a bit more.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to check those out. When did the movie come out?
2016 or something? Is that
okay.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
17
so.
Maybe?
Yeah, it might be 2017, I think.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's quite recent. It has a pretty powerful atmosphere to it, and it definitely has that weird feeling. I think that it probably has the story in general probably has an inspiration from Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, and also the film Stalker.
Yeah, right. I've only seen the film. I haven't read the book.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to reread the book in a new translation that's apparently available, because the one I read, I'm not sure. I feel like the Russian science fiction work hasn't been given the care and attention that the classic Russian literature has. And some of the decisions in Strugatsky translations are very strange. Like the one for Roadside Picnic, for some reason, it's a it's supposed to take place in Canada, and it's like written in this hard-boiled style that almost feels like an old detective novel. And I don't really think that that's the way the original was. And I don't think that's the way the new translation is either. So I'm kind of curious to see what that's like, because even though I didn't mind the choices, I kind of questioned whether that was... It didn't seem very Russian, you know, and I couldn't imagine why it would have been written that way in the 70s in Russia, right? Like, I don't know. It just seemed strange.
Well, I'll give you my opinion on it when we cover that work.
Yeah, it'd be really cool. Like, I think that at some point there is going to be a renaissance of them in the English-speaking world. Like, there's a new movie version of Hard to Be a God, which is one of their books as well, and that was made into a film in the 1980s, too. But there is a new version that received a lot more attention, probably because the original film was still part of the Soviet era, and people just don't really... I'm not sure, like, some of the stuff from that period isn't very recognized in the West still. But the new film got a lot of attention, so there's a number of other books that they wrote that probably could make pretty cool films, so that may happen in the future.
Yeah, hopefully. Were you reading anything else, Gretchen?
That's pretty much it. Most of my time has been spent reading for class.
Yeah.
A lot of critical theory.
Yeah, I can see that sucking up a lot of time. Yeah.
Lots of time on Samuel Beckett, right?
Oh, yes. I did have to write an essay about Samuel Beckett's Endgame, which I did enjoy. I really like his work, but after spending so much time on it, I'm probably going to give Beckett a rest for a bit.
Yeah, I find it's a lot easier to enjoy things when you don't have a test or a grade at the end of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's unfortunate to have like such a rigorous time constraint too on not only actually experiencing the thing, but synthesizing your thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't really... I mean, sometimes it's good because it helps you focus, but sometimes it's just like, I need a little more time to think about this, or I need a little more time to experience more that's similar before I can really synthesize any meaningful response to it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you only have a few weeks, so...
Yeah. No, such as academia.
Oh, I remember having to read several very long old English novels and not really having enough time. And kind of having to go to the internet to look up notes so that I could even write anything about them.
Yeah, a lot of those 19th century and before works that are like 800 or 900 pages long, I could definitely see that being tough to squeeze into a couple months' time, especially if you're doing other works alongside it.
Yeah. You're doing several classes at once,
right,
and having to read tomes like that,
yeah. It's
a lot to handle. And I've mentioned on the podcast many times before that I don't read very fast. I mean, I read at maybe speaking pace. So it takes a while for me to get through stuff. And even like the material that we're doing for the podcast by the last week, I'm usually still reading something. So, I mean, I don't mind that, but it takes a while. So it was definitely overwhelming at the time when I was sort of forced to work with multiple streams like that.
Yeah, I'm probably going to be revisiting one of those longer works again. I think I'm going to do Middlemarch in a couple months.
Awesome.
But in the last few months, in the last bonus episode we did, I said I was starting Wuthering Heights as a reread. I've finished that. Ooh. That's really one of my favorites. I just really enjoy how it feels like a gothic fever dream, and
yeah.
it's really intense and dark. But after that, I started again with a audiobook, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that was translated into modern English by Tolkien and read by Terry Jones of Monty Python fame. And he does a really good reading of it. Not all the way through yet, but it's pretty short, so I'll probably finish that soon and maybe do Middlemarch in the new year.
Yeah, Terry Jones is really good presenter of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I have watched a bunch of his history documentaries, and the way he puts it all together is really cool, and the way he presents it is really cool. I imagine listening to him read Sir Gawain would be pretty amazing.
Yeah,
so.
It's a type of work that really lends itself to being read, too. But as far as reading print stuff, I'm still making my way through Dark Descent. Unfortunately, I got a bit sidetracked with Henry James a couple episodes back and decided that I need a break from him for a while. So going to pick up with that again in maybe a month or so and get through his story, and then hopefully that'll be a good excuse to finish the rest.
Well, I mean, I think here's my feeling about short story anthologies, especially really big ones like that.
Yeah.
You can have them on your shelves and still have material for years to read from them, and the more of those things that you have, the better. And they're kind of like a gift that just keeps giving, right? Because there's always something in there that you can just go back to or read for the first time. And some of these, like The Dark Descent and The Weird, they're just so big. Like, they have so much stuff in them. It's not like a novel where you want to read it cover to cover. Just go through and you pick the ones that sound cool and save the rest for later. Maybe you'll make some really amazing discoveries. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about them anyway. So, I mean, there's a few times where I might skip a story and just read something else from the same book. And there's no real need to do it in any order or finish them or anything, really. It's awesome that they're there.
Yeah, and it is a very good collection, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I was talking today about The Foundations of Fear, which is kind of sort of the sequel anthology to The Dark Descent, or a follow-up anyway. Right. And it's edited by David Hartwell as well, and it has a greater focus on slightly longer works. Most of the stories in The Dark Descent are quite short. Some of them are sort of short in Foundations as well, but they tend to be a little more novella length. So there's fewer entries in there, but there's a lot of classics, including a lot of things that I think we'd like to cover on the podcast. It seems like there's a lot more sci-fi adjacent stuff in that book. Who Goes There by John Campbell is there. Bloodchild by Octavia Butler is there. There's a story by Philip K. Dick, The Faith of Our Fathers. There's We Purchase People by Frederick Pohl, which is just one of the most chilling science fiction / horror tinged stories that I think I've ever read. And a lot of good stuff in there. So, yeah, we'll be mining through some of that stuff, definitely. I think that pretty much covers everything that we wanted to cover this bonus episode. We hope that everyone has a great holiday time if you get some, which you better. I hope that you do. We will be back in less than a month. Everybody, do some reading and come back to go on a cold and perilous journey into Arctic realms.
All right.